Okay, I'll go ahead and kick things off here. A little bit about me, for those of you who haven't met me. My undergrad degree is in the biological sciences. I've done some genetic engineering and some industry research. I can probably use the mic. And some industry research. Then I went to seminary, spent time as a chaplain and counselor at a drug and alcohol rehab facility. And now I'm here at Berkeley and GTU, it's Graduate Theological Union off the north end of campus, in a program that deals with Christianity and science. I work with the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences there, and recently became an editor of the magazine Theology and Natural Science. Yeah, Theology and Science. So I figured, okay, why don't you come up and talk a little bit about science and Christianity. Typically in the media or in pronouncements, you hear about all the conflict that's between Christianity and science, and that these two cannot get along, they don't go together. And I've heard some of these things myself. From a Christian engineer told me, science is the tool of the devil. Really? Remind me not to drive across the bridge you designed. It's not true. Or in 2000, this was in a class. The topic of prayer came up, an intercessory prayer, praying for other people. And this person just turned on me and said, how can you possibly believe in prayer? In the 2006 Journal of Heart Medicine, they did a big study on prayer and found out that there is absolutely no difference between someone who gets prayed for in the doctor's office and someone who does not. And to make matters worse, 59% of the people who knew they were being prayed about did worse than the control group that received no prayer. And so this person just comes out with this and then tells me, not only do I think you're scientifically bankrupt for believing in prayer, but I think you're morally and ethically bankrupt too, to even suggest peddling this magic to hurting people. This was in front of a full class, and everyone just kind of like stared at me, and then they went on. Or in 2001, two researchers, Ackley and Newberg, did scans of people who were having religious experiences, meditation, or in prayer, and found out that certain parts of your parietal lobe light up. Didn't take very long, a few weeks later, major magazines and newspapers were saying, scientific proof, religion is all in your head. So how do we deal with this? How do we work with this? I'll give more answers to these a little later. I'll even go back. You often hear then, in the midst of all this conflict, some people say, well, they don't really conflict because science is based on fact and religion is based on faith. I have a bit of a problem with that statement, because a lot of time in Christianity, you know, these are based on actual historical events. There's facts here too. Which brings up the whole idea of what is blind faith? You have, I think it comes from Hebrews 11:1, where it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The thing is, this kind of faith is faith that's looking forward to the future, telling you to step out for God, for things in the future that you may not know what's going to happen yet. Well, that's true of science and Christianity, but that's not blind faith. I think anyone who says that faith needs to be blind faith or talks about blind faith is a little naive. Because in the Bible, God never asks people for blind faith. He always gives them a past and gives them a history. Even someone is like Abraham, where he's told to go out not knowing where you're going. He still has the experience, his experiences with God, and the history behind him of what God has already done. When we're asked to step out and do things, we have all the scriptures, we have our past experiences, and we have the testimonies of everyone else. Faith is never blind. So then I go to Proverbs 18:15. An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. Or even on the back of your program, where it talks about the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, and say, there's a lot to learn from nature. Study it. And it can point to God. So this whole idea of science based on fact and religion based on faith, I don't think that's accurate. And blind faith is never blind. Now, this whole science and Christianity thing, it's a huge subject area that I've been asked to compact into a short sermon. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, so we're going to kind of have a little helicopter tour. The major areas is we can talk about some past conflicts. You've heard about those in the news. We're mostly going to skim past those. Scientific evidence for belief. There's a lot of people that talk about areas of science that point to and support the idea of a creator God. There's a lot of books that have been written about this and can be its own sermon. I'll mostly pass by that. I'm going to focus more on how do you relate science and Christianity? What's the method? If you're in a scientific program, how do you be a good Christian scientist? There's also been a lot of famous Christian scientists. We'll touch on some of them and how their Christianity spurred them. Also talk a little bit about how the Christian worldview led to the rise of modern science. There's also hot areas of interdisciplinary research between Christianity and science. Right now it seems to be Christianity and environmentalism. You get books published hot off the presses on that subject. Coming up is neuroscience, and Christianity seems to be an upcoming one. In the past it was physics and Christianity. So there's a lot of developments going on. That's why we have the Center for Theology and Natural Science. But looking to how do you relate science and religion? Usually people divide them in different areas. I think depending on the topic, you can move between methods. You don't need to be limited to just one way. First, conflict. This is where Christianity and science are butting heads. And usually what happens is scientism. This word is where you just believe science is all there is nothing to religion, and it should be eliminated. It's like, I will destroy you. This is where I think there should be conflict. If a scientist comes out that way, that theology, Christianity, religion should be eliminated, gonna have some conflict. To use a big nerdy term, ontological reductionism. Basically that's just when you say matter is the only reality. Everything in the world is reducible to physics, and that's all there ever is and all there ever will be. And the scientific method is the only path to knowledge. Just to note, these are all faith statements. These are not statements that you can actually test.
Wow.
And so this has its own starting point in faith. I'll share a little story that my advisor tells me. He's got a good friend who's a medical doctor, not a Christian, and told him, well, Mr. Doctor, have you ever had an experience in the medical field where someone is really sick on their deathbed and just miraculously gets better and goes home? He says, yes, all the time. We call them anomalies, not miracles. And so it's like, receiving information that conflicts with my core belief system, must get rid of it. It's an anomaly, not a miracle. But to realize, if someone comes from that position, those are faith statements too. Then there's this whole idea of scientific imperialism. This is where you don't try to do away with religion. You just try to say, yes, there's something to it, but it can be explained through natural science. So a very functional approach. Religion is good to keep people acting nicely in society, but there's really no factual basis behind it. And it has a biological explanation. Maybe it evolved as a useful tool to help us survive and not kill and eat each other. But it still also in its own way seeks to push religion to the sideline and just take it over as a scientific research project. This is where there's going to be conflict. And I give these categories too so that when you hear people talk or read things in newspapers or magazines, you can see, what are they coming from? What's their background? Or from the church side, this is like ecclesiastical authoritarianism. This is where the church should control all scientific research projects. What you research and what you do not research. That's overreaching, I think. Or then there's biblical literalism. usually says if there's a problem between the Bible and science, there's a problem with the science. And a lot of times I can go with that. And I definitely take a lot of things in the Bible. Yeah, it should be pretty literal. But there's also times when some scientific pronouncements should make us reflect and think, have I been interpreting the Bible the right way? That's good. To quote Galileo, when he was having a conflict with the church on whether the earth was the center of the solar system or the sun, Galileo says, I believe the Bible is 100% true. I just interpret it a little differently than the prevailing opinion. To use an example, you have people come forward and say the Bible says the earth is 4,000 years old. And then a lot of geologists say, I think it's much, much older than that. And then that could prompt, okay, go back to the Bible, research, and look at, well, where does the 4,000 years come from? Well, there's a guy in the Middle Ages named Bishop Ussher who took those genealogies, he must have had a lot of extra time on his hands, and just counted them backward, all of them, and came up with it, and did his math and came up with a figure of 4,000 years. But he's assuming that those genealogies are complete, which is a pretty big assumption, especially when the Hebrew people would often leave out someone from the genealogy if they didn't think you were important. And if you cross-compare identical lists of genealogies, you realize the names aren't always the same because they include different people or leave them out depending on what the purpose was for doing that name list. So thank you, Bishop Ussher, for giving us all this present-day conflict. But when you have the geological record, it can help us go back and examine, okay, where does this belief come from? And maybe we need to rethink how we are doing some interpretation, at least in dialogue. After investigation, we may think, no, science, you're wrong. But at least we've done the searching and can come back and respond with evidence. And often with biblical literalism, can see some scientists as narrow-minded in their own little science religion, unwilling to consider outside evidence. That would be Mr. Dr. Anomaly. You just ignore any evidence that conflicts. So basically, with all this conflict going on, motivated some people, why don't we just send religion to its corner and science to its corner, and that way there's no more fighting. You're in separate ends of the sandbox. Call this view independence. And actually, if you know Stephen Jay Gould, that was what he really pushed. And it's the whole idea of science and religion, they're in their own different domain, they talk about their own different things. Science asks questions of how, religion asks questions of why, and so therefore you never fight. Science deals with fact, and religion deals with morality and value. Reason versus revelation, proof versus faith, subject versus objective. It's helpful, and sometimes it's true. When you're doing chemistry, it may not always talk about the meaning of the universe. But still, both science and religion are talking about the same reality. And like I said earlier, religion has its facts. And so independence doesn't always work. And so we talk about how do we bring them together? How do you get science and religion working together nicely? First with dialogue. There's a lot of areas that science can't really reach, such as ethical issues. Science can often tell us what is, but is not able to tell us what we ought to do very well. Those are called the boundary areas. Or like I mentioned earlier, what are the conditions that you can even do science in the first place? Those come from faith statements. Their methods can be the same, and both science and theology, religion, can learn from one another. Or ethical issues. Science by itself is usually not enough to solve economic or environmental problems. Knowing the facts is often not enough to create action directed in a certain way. Example, Cal has figured this out, and now they've asked GTU to co-teach a lot of their environmental classes with a religion professor and a science professor. Because they figured that just stating the facts of science is not motivating people to move in a certain direction. And so that's been going on for 3 years now. Kind of a fun class, took it. And science can also see the need for theology to address the lack of meaning that's often found in today's society. And can be a door to discuss religion with scientists, such as that class at Cal that's co-taught with religion and a scientist. Brings in a lot of scientists just really questioning. You can try to integrate them. This thing called natural theology, that's where you infer the existence of God from design and nature. The universe seems to be so fine-tuned for life to happen. It seems to point to a creator God. A lot of people do. A lot of books have been written on that. Or theology of nature, scientific discoveries can even shape theological belief. A good example would be scientists keep saying, we haven't really found a soul yet in here. And that has prompted a lot of books to go back and say, okay, what did the Hebrews mean by when they talk about soul? And has really enriched biblical scholarship. And then the God question is starting to come up on its own in the sciences. Thermodynamics, quantum theory, Big Bang seem to point to this whole God question. Even if religion wasn't out in the picture, these scientists are starting to say, he's kind of pointing to something here. What's up? And so the God question is being asked by scientists, even before Christians or any religion starts getting involved. So in the Christian worldview, mentioned earlier that it helped precipitate the rise of modern science. The idea that it's always been warfare, yeah. It hasn't always been warfare. Most of the early great universities were started as religious schools. Science and Christianity used to get along quite well. Just think, before Christianity, a lot of people had the worldview that the universe was eternal, it's always been there. It was necessary and always cyclical. And then Christianity comes and says, no, the universe is not eternal, it had a beginning, and it will have an end. And it kind of just disrupts your thinking. It's like, well, if it hasn't always been there, it has a beginning, it has an end, it starts shifting people to a linear type of thinking. And just people to start thinking in terms of cause and effect. Not everything has happened because it's just part of the same cycle that always happens. It's like, no, there's something that directly causes something else that causes something else, and we better figure this out. And if the universe hasn't always been here, it's not eternal, it's not necessary, so there must be a reason why it exists. It gives rise to curiosity. So why does it exist? We need to figure this out. Then there's this whole idea of a belief in an only God that gave certain moral laws. And if he gives these moral laws, well, he probably gave us laws of nature too. A lawgiver implies laws of nature, so we'd understand God more if we start reading this book of nature and figuring out, okay, what's these laws? To quote a famous scientist named Kepler, by doing science, I feel I am thinking God's thoughts after him. Or a belief in a rational God, a God that is logical. A rational God would create a rational creation, and so therefore creation would turn out to be intelligible, and you can investigate it. And a big one is a belief in the separation between the creator and the creation. Prior to Christianity, a lot of people thought the tree's a god. And if the tree is a god, you certainly don't want to cut it down, break it down, and study it. That would be a very bad thing to do and invite wrath. But if creation is not divine, you can actually study it. And also, some people's worldviews have that creation is an illusion or a distraction. If that is your particular belief, why are you practicing science? You're not following your religion very well. But for Christianity, creation is good. It's not divine. It's not an illusion. It's not a distraction. It's good. So it's good to study it. And God was the author of the Bible. The Bible speaks truth. God is the author of nature. Therefore, nature should speak truth. I'm talking about these are the logical processes of a lot of these early scientists. God's truth should be in the book of nature too. If you look at a lot of early writings, they talk about the book of nature. And then if humanity was created in the image of God, God is logical and orderly, so we can trust in our own reason. So this is how Christianity contributed to the birth of modern science. To quote scientist Paul Davies, I'll just go ahead and read it. In the ensuing 300 years, the theological dimension of science has faded. People take it for granted that the physical world is both ordered and intelligible. The underlying order in nature, the laws of physics, are simply accepted as given as brute facts. Nobody asks where they came from. At least they don't do so in polite company. However, even the most atheist scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd, that there is a rational basis to physical existence manifested as law-like order in nature that is at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can only proceed if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview.
Wow.
Now here's where it gets a little nerdy. If someone wants to hand out these, you can have, there's a chart, you can follow along with the chart if you want. Take the chart home with you. Have a few more. And this is where kind of a methodology developed by Robert Russell. He works at the Center for Theology and Natural Science, and how different ways that you can relate science with Christianity. A lot of information in this chart. Basically, looking at the scientific method is a little more nuanced, using philosophy. If you don't have a philosophical background, don't worry. But using Kuhn, Lakatos, Polanyi, Feyerabend, Toulmin. One person's getting excited, the philosopher. Basically, it says how science seems to work is you have your networks of theories there at the top, and then your beliefs and experience and interpretation then feeds into what data you gather. And once you get the data, you have to develop models of the data that feed back into making networks of theories. And into your data can be affected by the assumptions that you bring to the table. Example, okay, you have to make an analogy like the atom. It's like they're like little planets with the protons and neutrons in the middle and the electrons orbiting around it. It's a good model. Is it entirely accurate? No. But it comes reasonably close, and it's a good tool to learn. But then, this is how science kind of works. And then, this is also how theology, religion often works. You have your doctrines, and then your beliefs influence your experience and interpretation. You have your data, scripture, reason, tradition, and experience. Doesn't mean they're all equal. Often you have scripture, and you have your experience. Then you have to develop models and analogies too. Example, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. It's often used as a model, a legal model. He paid for our sins. Is that everything about Jesus? No. Dying on the cross was also victory over Satan. Dying on the cross was also giving people freedom. There's a cosmic dimension. It's more than just a legal model, but the legal model is also true. And so theology works that way. Also, one little point to make, when they're talking about conflict between theology and science, it's often presented as science as this monolithic entity that speaks with one voice. Absolutely not true. If you've ever been to a scientific conference of even scientists all in the same field, you just sit down and it's often you have your each scientist has their own theories, and there's some competing theories, and they fight about it. So someone says science says this, you say, okay, which scientists and what do the opposing scientists say? It seems like the way Christian denominations can argue sometimes is the exact same thing you can find in scientific conferences. It's no real difference. But then using this little chart, how do you move between them? And that's that little handout, little paths. If you look at little number 1, scientific theories, I'm not saying everyone uses these paths. Everyone kind of has their favorite way to go. These science can act as data which places constraints on theology, so how much you can say. Like the scientific geological record can place some constraints on what you say about the age of the earth from the Bible. Or if you're talking about how God acts, you might choose not to violate special relativity, taking science into account directly as data. Or you can have scientific data that you need to explain religiously. Real good one, t equals 0. That means the very beginning of time in the universe can be explained religiously as God creating from nothing. And such scientific data can help confirm and advance a theological concept. Or you take your scientific theories, analyze them philosophically, and then use them indirectly as data. A good example would be, okay, you analyze quantum theory. Oh, you said your dad does that?
Yeah.
Well, hey, someone's doing that work. Don't mean to embarrass you. It's like if you take quantum mechanics, interpret it indeterministically, then you can see, okay, that might be how God can work. God can work at the quantum level and not violate physical laws. My own opinion is God can violate physical laws as much as he very well pleases, without actually violating them. Example, the law of gravity. Something will fall at this rate, well, unless it's in a different context, like my hand is there to catch it. The law is still valid, it just performs differently. Or one way that someone do is you create a whole philosophical system, and then you can hang your religious doctrines and your scientific evidence on it. My personal example for those that may know more philosophical stuff, process philosophy does this. Personally, I don't think they do it very well, and no one's really done this path well. I think that sometimes your religion and your science has to change a little, and sometimes can turn out looking funky. New Age does this too. You develop a New Age system and then hang your doctrines and stuff on it. But maybe someone in the future will do this better. And then scientific theories can function by just basically inspiring you. A lot of physicists are inspired by this great complexity they see in creation, and it actually advances their faith. Eastern Orthodoxy, that's how they approach science. Science is an act of worship in and of itself, because you're looking at all this and you're discovering more about God in your very investigation. So science serves as inspiration. But then how does it go the other way? That was science toward religion. How does religion impact science? Path 6 through 8. And we've already talked about this. Theology provides some of the philosophical assumptions which the scientific method requires to operate. An example, one of my friends was at a conference. A well-known scientist there says, "Why do they even let you Christians here? You shouldn't even be allowed to attend." And my friend, who's rather outspoken, said, "Well, okay, as long as you agree you couldn't exist without me." And the guy got quiet, see his face wrinkle up. "I don't like that, but I can't disagree with it. And I just won't talk to you." And then he left. Or path 7, religious beliefs can inspire new scientific theories. A big example, if you look into the history of quantum theory, almost all the early scientists in quantum theory developed their approach based upon their religious background. Like Bohr, his theories were influenced by Kierkegaard. There was another one that was influenced by his Hindu background, but they developed their theory because it was such a weird thing that they were looking at anyway. That they developed their theories because of their religious background. Or there was this physicist named Hoyle. When this whole Big Bang thing comes out, he's like, "This can't be true. I hate the idea of God. But if Big Bang is true, that means there is a God." So he devoted the rest of his career to trying to find out an alternative to Big Bang. He was, poor guy. He was but this is where you can see someone's religious background is motivating their science. Or a personal fun story is Louis Pasteur. Those that know him, founder of modern germ theory. inventor of the vaccine. Basically, what happened with him is, prior to Mr. Louis, people believed that the germs that cause disease just spontaneously created themselves in chemicals. Spontaneous generation. And he says, that can't be true. My Christian belief says that only God is a creator. Things cannot create themselves. And so he says, I'm going to go investigate, because I know, because of my Christianity, that the prevailing belief can't be true. And then he discovers germs, and now we have vaccines. So his Christian belief motivated him. Or path 8, it's like, okay, you have competing scientific rules or scientific ideas. Well, then theology can help you select which one you prefer. A good example would be the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's like that one's is indeterminist. So sorry, more big words. Basically, it says that is there something that is not determined in nature, or then there's other people that prefer a rival opinion that say no, everything has to be determined. That can't be true. But then if you say, if I believe in free will, then everything in the universe cannot be determined. Because then that would mean my whole brain would be determined, and everything in my life would be determined. And I have to believe there's something that's not determined in nature, so I'll prefer this approach over the everything's determined approach. And so your Christian belief says, in competing theories, I'll pick that one over that one. So what about these Christian scientists? You can actually chart these different people and how they use different paths. Those of you with a scientific background might recognize a lot of these names. Kepler came up with the laws of planetary motion. He was motivated by the belief that God created the world with an intelligent plan, and so he can figure it out. Developed laws of planetary motion. Copernicus, Sir Francis Bacon, he established a scientific method, and if you look at how did he develop it, he did it by those are things I talked about earlier. And he has a quote, "Atheism is the result of insufficient depth of philosophy."
Wow.
Or René Descartes. If you've heard the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," that's quoted a lot, but people often neglect what was his step 2. Step 1 was, "I think, therefore I am." Step 2 is, you have to have the existence of God. For if only God exists and would not want us to be deceived by our experience, can then we trust our senses and logical processes? The textbooks usually leave step 2 out. But he says you can't prove your existence until you add God. Galileo, mentioned him already. He had a conflict with the church, but he was still just as much of a believing Christian. Pascal, if you want a fun book, look up the book Pensées. Pascal did a whole lot in science, but he also wrote Christianity books. Newton, you heard about him. He's really big in physics, but he actually wrote more on Christianity than he did on science. Or Robert Boyle, Boyle's Law for Gases, father of modern chemistry. He was considered a really strong Christian of his time. Believed that the study of nature was a central religious duty, and then he used his funds to fund the Bible translations of Irish and Turkish. Thank you, father of modern chemistry. Faraday, for electricity and magnetism. Kelvin, he was considered a deep man of faith. He also had a lot of pride issues, but God was working on him with that. Gregor Mendel, the founder of genetics, not only did he look like Kelsey Grammer, he helped advance modern genetics, and he was a monk. Which meant he also had a lot of time on his hands to study all these hundreds of pea plants. Max Planck for quantum theory, John Dalton for atomic theory, Fleming founded modern electronics, Maxwell, the electromagnetic theory of light. He'd fit in Berkeley with that beard. Or Louis Pasteur, we just discussed him already. Or how about Albert Einstein? Albert Einstein was not Christian, but he was a theist. His famous quote, "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. A non-created universe is impossible." Or another Christian scientist, Charles Darwin. Up until, for most of his life, he believed that there was no problem with his theory of evolution and his Christian beliefs. It was only at the very end of his life that he came out and said, you know, evolution and Christianity don't work together. But the funny thing is he didn't say that until right after his daughter died. And so, which leads one to think, you know, if there are scientific reasons for you to reject Christianity, those can be valid, address them, look into it. But sometimes those scientific reasons can be smokescreens for what might really be going on. My hypothesis, to use that science word, with Charles Darwin is that his real issue was the death of his daughter. And then he used the science as a smokescreen, which, if he would have dealt with the real issue, might have helped him out. Or another story, when I was counseling at the drug program. So one guy comes into my office, Alan, my faith is flagging. Please, can you give me some evidences for the faith, talk about scientific supports for the faith, and really help me out here? And I asked him, are you drinking again? And he was, yes! How did you know? And I was like, well, in this case, your belief was fading because you had two conflicting things in your brain, your scientific belief and your drinking, and one of them was going to start giving. Wow. And it had absolutely nothing to do with the science. I could give you reasons till I was blue in the face and it would make no difference. And so, to go back to, if there is science reasons for opposing Christianity, look into them. But also take some time and look into yourself. If you had those science questions answered, would you take that step, or is there another reason? And then maybe that reason would be one to look at and deal with. So, okay, I'm a scientist and I want to be a good Christian. How do I do that? First, just live a life that reflects God. I'd say quite a majority of science really doesn't deal with these big picture issues. You show up, you do your work, you fill your test tubes, you get a result. And it's the big picture issues don't kind of come into it. So just live a life that reflects God. Have good fruit, not bad fruit. Wow. And if you want to be a witness to other scientists, just live the right life. And hopefully science can also inspire you, like Kepler. You're thinking God's thoughts after him. Or there's this one scientist, Polkinghorne, says, I know God's language is math. I hope not. But it was great that he could be inspired in that way. Another thing that helps, I think, when I went to seminary, I heard some of these professors say they really like it when scientists come to Bible school because you're trained in observation. You become so good at biblical interpretation. I use an example, just a verse that many are familiar with, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And so look at it scientifically. Start to dissect it. It's like, the Lord. Okay, so why does this verse use the word Lord instead of God? Is my shepherd. It doesn't say the shepherd, it says my shepherd. What does that mean? And it says, I shall not want. What is the relation between shepherd and not wanting? The verse says, it says I shall not want. It doesn't say I shall not lack. So what about that? The Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Makes me, not invites me. And so you can just start thinking, even just that little sentence, you can just observe and dig and ask questions like a scientist. And then when you start answering those questions that you start coming up with, then you start creating sermons. I once saw one person write I gave this as an exercise. He wrote a whole page of questions on the first verse of Psalm 23. And we think we know that verse so well. And so take that training and observation and use it well. Padawan. And then to be a Christian Scientist, you also have the ability to be in a place to answer scientific pronouncements that overreach. A good example is to go back to the beginning. In 2001, Achille Newberg showed that how the brain lights up. Religion's all in your head. Well, everything you do lights up your brain. When I talk to my wife, my brain's lighting up. Doesn't mean she doesn't exist. Your brain's lighting up listening to me right now. It doesn't mean I don't exist. And so if your brain's lighting up when you're having a religious experience of God, that's no surprise. That's the way we work. So that pronouncement overreached big time. Or how about the 2006 Journal of Heart Medicine, scientific proof that prayer is worthless. After this guy told me this, I looked back into the science and realized that, you can question their methods. For example, when they said 59% of those who knew they were being prayed for did worse than those who didn't get prayed for, well, he realized they told them they were being prayed for right when they were being wheeled into the operating room. And so this poor person's like, I'm going to get operated on. And the doctor comes over. We have a whole team praying for you. And then he realized this guy on the table's like, you have a whole team praying for me? Why? How bad am I off? The stress meter goes, and so they started doing worse because they were stressing everyone out on their way to the operating room. Am I so bad off that I have to get prayed for? And then it was reflected in the results. Or even, what's their methods on how they're praying for? They gave everyone a card, believer or unbeliever, to pray, and saying, pray these exact words. So that way, we can't keep it scientifically uniform. But is that really prayer? No. And then, if you have someone sick in the non-prayer group, can you really keep their family and loved ones from praying for them? Just because the scientists asked you to? Because they want to get good results? Yeah. And so all of a sudden you realize, this particular study has a whole lot of flaws. Yeah. And to come out and say prayer is worthless based on that study is way overreaching. And it helps to have scientists be able to point that out. Or here's one I hear on Berkeley's campus. Religion has caused more wars than anything in history and so should just be flat out outlawed. The world would be a better, more harmonious place if religion was gone. Well, thanks to a couple sociologists, they decided, well, let's investigate this. And they traced all the recorded wars in history and found out religion has caused 7% of the wars in history. It's like, okay. So if that statement comes out, it's like, false. Granted, 7% is still 7% too much. Yeah. But it's not a majority. And so just to kind of do this helicopter survey, hopefully helps you, if you're doing science, approach your scientists with your science with greater faith. To be able to use science in your faith. And to know how to work with science or where to say, maybe they just need a little more investigation. So this is a helicopter tour. There's a lot more that can be said about all of this. I have whole semester classes on this. So we can talk more later. But that wraps this up. If you have more questions later, I'm happy to answer them. Just closing a quick word of prayer before I